She was a mail-order bride by mistake. The kind of mistake that makes you want to wring a postman's neck. The man she thought was her groom looked at her as though she'd been delivered by freight wagon instead of fate. So she stayed, found work as a housekeeper, and learned to sweep floors like she was sweeping away her own humiliation. Folks whispered, of course, but she carried herself as if to say, let them talk. They weren't the ones who sat through 3 days of stagecoach dust to be told they were surplus cargo. The summer of 1882 brought more than just scorching heat to Copper Ridge, Montana. It brought Fielder Haskett stepping off the afternoon stage with dust on his pressed suit and uncertainty written across his face like a wanted poster. At 24, he possessed the soft hands of a Boston clerk and the wide-eyed wonder of a man who'd never seen a mountain that wasn't made of brick and mortar. Fielder clutched a leather satchel containing 3 changes of clothes, his grandfather's pocket watch, and a letter from his uncle Grovelin Tate, a letter that had changed the course of his life with 8 simple words. Come west, boy. Time you learned to be a man. The Copper Ridge Depot consisted of little more than a weathered platform and a hand-painted sign that looked ready to surrender to the next strong wind. Fielder squinted against the afternoon glare, searching for his uncle among the handful of locals who'd gathered to watch the stage arrive. In small towns, the stagecoach was better entertainment than a traveling circus. You must be the nephew, came a gruff voice from behind him. Fielder turned to find a man built like a fence post, tall, weathered and immovable. Grovelin Tate wore his 67 years in the lines around his eyes and the silver threading through his beard. His handshake could have cracked walnuts. Uncle Grovelin? Fielder's voice cracked slightly, making him sound younger than his years. That's right. Though out here folks just call me Tate. The older man's gaze swept over Fielder's city attire with barely concealed amusement. Well, I'll be. You're even greener than I expected. Come on, boy. Let's get you to the ranch before you wilt in this heat. The wagon ride to the Lazy Tay Ranch took 40 minutes through terrain that made Fielder's spine ache with every bump and rut. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, rolling hills covered in prairie grass that whispered secrets to the wind, punctuated by clusters of cottonwoods that provided precious shade. Mountains loomed in the distance like sleeping giants, their peaks touched with snow even in summer. Beautiful country, Fielder ventured, trying to make conversation. Beautiful enough, Tate agreed. But beauty don't pay the bills or keep the cattle fed. This land'll test every inch of you, boy. Strip you down to what you really are, underneath all that city polish. The ranch house came into view as they crested a small hill, a sturdy 2-story structure built from local timber, with a wide front porch that had seen countless sunsets. Outbuildings dotted the property, a barn that could house 20 horses, a bunkhouse for the hands, and various sheds for equipment and feed. It was a working ranch, built for function rather than show. As they pulled up to the front porch, the screen door opened with a sharp creak. Out stepped a woman who commanded attention without saying a word. Melrose Draven possessed the kind of presence that filled a room, or in this case, a front yard. At 26, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd weathered storms and emerged stronger for it. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, with a few rebellious strands framing a face that was handsome rather than pretty. Her dress was simple calico, faded from countless washings, but spotlessly clean. What struck Fielder most were her eyes, sharp as winter morning and twice as unforgiving. So, this is the apprentice, she said, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. Her voice carried the faintest hint of an accent Fielder couldn't place. Looks like he'd blow away in a stiff breeze. Melrose, meet my nephew Fielder, Tate said, climbing down from the wagon. Fielder, this is Miss Draven. She keeps the house running and the rest of us in line. Fielder tipped his hat, politely. Pleased to meet you, Miss Draven. She looked him up and down like she was evaluating livestock. We'll see about that. You ever worked with your hands, boy? I clerked in a shipping office for 3 years, Fielder replied, a touch of defensiveness creeping into his voice. Clerking, she said it, like it was a disease. Well, that explains the soft look about you. Don't worry. A few weeks out here, and you'll either toughen up or head back east with your tail between your legs. My money's on the tail, Tate chuckled. Don't mind Melrose. She's got a tongue sharp enough to cut glass, but she cooks like an angel and works twice as hard as any 2 men. You'd do well to listen to her. I always listen to my elders, Fielder said, immediately realizing his mistake. Melrose's eyebrows shot up. Elders? Boy, I'm not even 30 years old. Maybe you need spectacles along with everything else. The first evening at the Lazy Tab passed in a blur of introductions and awkward silences. Dinner consisted of beef stew that could have fed half of Boston, fresh bread that melted in your mouth, and conversation that died quicker than a match in a rainstorm. Fielder tried to make small talk. This stew is excellent, Miss Draven. What's your secret? Cooking the meat until it's dead, she replied, without missing a beat. Tate nearly choked on his coffee. She means she cooks it thoroughly. I know what I mean, Melrose said, serving herself another helping. City folk have delicate stomachs, can't handle food with any character to it. After dinner, Tate showed Fielder to his room, a small space under the eaves, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the corral. It was spartanly furnished, but clean, and the mattress was surprisingly comfortable. Get some rest, Tate advised. Tomorrow we start your education proper. And boy, don't let Melrose's sharp tongue bother you. She's had a hard road, and that wit of hers is mostly armor. What kind of hard road? Fielder asked. Tate paused in the doorway. That's her story to tell, not mine. Just remember, anyone tough enough to survive out here has earned their thorns along with their roses. Alone in his room, Fielder unpacked his few belongings and tried to process the day. Through the thin walls, he could hear the low murmur of voices from the kitchen. Tate and Melrose discussing ranch business, their conversation punctuated by the occasional laugh. He felt like an outsider looking in, which he supposed he was. The next morning arrived with a rooster's crow that sounded like a rusty gate. Fielder stumbled downstairs to find Melrose already in the kitchen, coffee brewing and bacon sizzling in a cast-iron skillet that looked older than the territory itself. Morning sunshine, she said without turning around. Hope you're ready to work, because daylight's burning. Good morning, Miss Draven. Fielder accepted a cup of coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. What time does the day usually start around here? Before sunrise if you're smart. After sunrise if you want to spend your day chasing your own tail. She set a plate in front of him, loaded with eggs, bacon and biscuits. Eat up. You'll need your strength for what's coming. Tate appeared in the doorway, fully dressed and ready for the day, despite the early hour. Morning, boy. Ready to learn what it means to be a rancher? Fielder nodded eagerly, though his stomach was doing small flips. I'm ready, Uncle. We'll see about that, Melrose muttered. But there might have been the faintest trace of a smile at the corner of her mouth. The first lesson took place in the barn, where Tate introduced Fielder to the art of saddling a horse. What should have been a simple task turned into an exercise in frustration. The saddle was heavier than it looked, the horse was less cooperative than expected, and Fielder's city-soft hands weren't accustomed to the rough leather and stubborn buckles. Easy does it, Tate instructed, as Fielder wrestled with the cinch strap. The horse can tell you're nervous. Horses are like women. They sense fear and uncertainty from a mile away. Melrose, who had been watching from the barn door, snorted. Horses have more sense than most women I know. At least they're honest about wanting to kick you. Fielder finally managed to get the saddle in place, though it sat crooked and loose. When he tried to mount, the saddle slipped sideways, dumping him unceremoniously in the dirt. Well, Melrose observed dryly, at least you found the ground fast enough. That horse'll have you buckled tighter than a church corset if you don't learn to cinch it properly. The first week of Fielder's apprenticeship played out like a comedy of errors, with Melrose providing running commentary that was both merciless and oddly encouraging. Each morning brought new challenges and fresh opportunities for humiliation. On Tuesday, Fielder attempted to move hay bales from the storage loft to the barn floor. The bales weighed nearly as much as he did, and his first attempt at lifting one resulted in him losing his balance and tumbling down with the hay, landing in an undignified heap at the bottom of the ladder. Graceful as a three-legged cat, Melrose remarked from the doorway, "Maybe we should tie a rope around your waist so you don't break your fool neck." "I'm fine," Fielder gasped, spitting out straw and trying to salvage his dignity. "Oh, I can see that. Nothing says fine like wearing half the hayloft." She walked over and began efficiently stacking the scattered hay. "Here's a thought. Use your legs instead of your back, and try not to lean backwards while you're lifting. Physics isn't just for city engineers." Wednesday brought the challenge of cattle branding, which required holding down a calf while Tate applied the hot iron. Fielder's job was supposedly simple: keep the animal still for the few seconds it took to make the mark. Reality proved more complicated than theory. The first calf kicked free before the brand was halfway done, leaving a partial mark that would need to be repeated. The second calf somehow twisted around and managed to step on Fielder's boot, prompting a yelp that spooked 3 other animals. By the third attempt, Fielder was sweating, dirty, and beginning to question his life choices. "You're wrestling with them like they're your mortal enemy," Melrose called out. She had taken a break from her laundry to watch the proceedings, clearly enjoying the entertainment. "Calm down, hold firm, and it'll be over before you know it. Fight them and you'll be out here until Christmas." "Easy for you to say," Fielder panted, trying to get a grip on a particularly squirmy calf. "You're not the one getting kicked." "No, I'm the one who has to patch up your bruises afterward." She leaned against the fence rail, though I suppose black and blue might be an improvement on that pasty city complexion. Thursday's disaster occurred in the kitchen, of all places. Melrose had been called away to help a neighbor woman with a difficult birth, leaving Fielder and Tate to fend for themselves for the midday meal. Tate, claiming he had urgent business in town, deputized Fielder to cook lunch. "How hard can it be?" Fielder muttered to himself, surveying the kitchen. "Melrose makes it look easy enough." He decided on something simple: beef stew, using leftover roast from the previous night's dinner. The recipe seemed straightforward: meat, vegetables, broth, seasonings. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. First he confused salt and sugar, adding 3 tablespoons of sugar to what was supposed to be a savory stew. Then, in an attempt to compensate, he added extra salt, creating a concoction that was both cloyingly sweet and unbearably salty. The vegetables were either undercooked and hard as rocks, or overcooked and mushy as baby food. The final insult came when he accidentally dumped coffee grounds directly into the pot instead of the coffee pot, turning the entire mess into a gritty, caffeinated nightmare. Tate returned to find Fielder staring hopelessly at a pot of something that defied culinary description. "Sweet mother of pearl," Tate breathed, peering into the pot. "What in tarnation is that?" "Lunch," Fielder offered weakly. Melrose chose that moment to return, taking one look at the kitchen and immediately assessing the situation. She lifted the lid of the pot, peered inside, and shook her head slowly. "If you keep cooking like that, Cowboy, the coyotes'll be sending thank you notes. They'll appreciate you poisoning their food competition." She set down her medical bag and rolled up her sleeves. "Step aside before you accidentally set something else on fire." "I didn't set anything on fire," Fielder protested. "Give it time," she replied, already pulling ingredients from the pantry. Days still young, within an hour, she had transformed the disaster into an edible meal, though she made sure Fielder understood the full extent of his culinary catastrophe. "Cooking isn't about following orders like you're drilling soldiers," she explained, while chopping onions with practiced efficiency. You have to pay attention to what you're doing. Salt doesn't look like sugar if you actually look at it. Coffee grounds don't belong in stew unless you're trying to keep everyone awake for 3 days straight. I was trying to help, Fielder said defensively. Help comes in many forms. Sometimes the best help is staying out of the kitchen. She glanced at him sideways, though I suppose everyone has to learn somehow, even in hopeless cases like yourself. Friday brought what would later be known around the ranch as the Great Milking Disaster. Tate had decided Fielder needed to learn all aspects of ranch life, including the daily chores that kept things running smoothly. Milking the cows seemed like a good place to start. It's simple enough, Tate explained, demonstrating the proper technique on Bessie, a patient Holstein who had been through this routine thousands of times. Firm grip, steady rhythm, don't pull too hard, or she'll kick you into next week. Fielder nodded confidently. How difficult could it be? He settled onto the 3-legged stool beside Bessie and reached for what he assumed were the appropriate appendages. What happened next became a ranch legend. Instead of reaching for the cow's udder, Fielder somehow managed to position himself beside a young bull who had wandered into the barn. The confusion lasted only a few seconds, but those seconds were enough to send the bull into a panic and Fielder flying backwards off the stool. The commotion brought Melrose running from the house, and she arrived just in time to see Fielder picking himself up from the barn floor, while the bull snorted indignantly from the other side of the stall. "Sweet Jesus," she gasped, and then burst into laughter. "Did you just try to milk Hercules?" "Hercules?" Fielder looked confused. "The bull, you nincompoop." She was laughing so hard she had to lean against the barn wall for support. "You just tried to milk a bull." Tate, who had been equally confused by the sudden commotion, took one look at the situation and began laughing as well. "Boy," I said, "milk the cow, not wrestle with the livestock." "I thought," Fielder began, then stopped, realizing how ridiculous he must sound. "You thought what? Do bulls give milk?" Melrose wiped tears from her eyes. "Lord have mercy. I've seen some greenhorn mistakes in my time, but trying to milk a bull? That's going in the record books." For the next 3 days, Fielder couldn't walk past the barn without someone making a comment about his milking technique. Melrose was particularly merciless, working references to the incident into nearly every conversation. "Fielder, could you bring in more firewood and try to make sure it's actually wood this time, not something you need to milk first? Pass the butter, assuming you can tell the difference between butter and bull. Don't work too hard out there. We don't want you getting confused about which end of the horse to saddle." Despite the constant teasing, something began to shift in the dynamic between Fielder and Melrose. Her jokes, while still sharp, seemed to carry less malice and more affection. She began offering practical advice along with the sarcasm. "The trick to milking," she explained, while demonstrating proper technique, "is to relax. The cow can tell if you're nervous, and nervous hands make for a cranky cow. And for the love of all that's holy, make sure you're actually working with a cow this time." "I'm never going to live that down, am I?" Fielder asked ruefully. "Not in this lifetime," she confirmed cheerfully. "But don't worry. In a few years, some other greenhorn will do something even more spectacular, and then you'll only be the second most famous milking disaster in Copper Ridge history." "That's comforting. I live to comfort," she said with a grin that was more genuine than mocking. By the end of his second week, Fielder had managed to master a few basic skills. He could saddle a horse without the saddle sliding sideways. Most of the time, he could lift hay bales without falling off ladders usually. And he had successfully avoided trying to milk any more bulls, a personal victory. The improvement didn't go unnoticed by the ranch hands, who had been watching his progress with the interest of spectators at a horse race. Benton Rourke, the foreman, was particularly impressed by Fielder's persistence. Most city boys would have packed up and headed home after the first week. Benton observed to Tate while they watched Fielder attempt to mend a section of fence. "This one's got sand, even if he doesn't know a hammer from a horseshoe half the time." "He's learning," Tate agreed. "Slowly, but he's learning. And Melrose has stopped making bets on when he'll give up and catch the next stage home." "That's progress," Benton said. "When Melrose stops betting against you, you know you're doing something right." The evening of Fielder's second Friday at the ranch, he found himself alone with Melrose in the kitchen while she prepared the next day's bread. The routine had become comfortable. She would work while he sat at the kitchen table, mending tack or studying ranch ledgers by lamplight. "You've stopped trying to kill yourself with simple tasks," she observed, punching down bread dough with more force than strictly necessary. "That's an improvement. Thank you." Fielder wasn't sure if it was a compliment or an insult. It was a compliment, believe it or not. She began shaping the dough into loaves. "When you first arrived, I gave you 2 weeks before you'd be crying for your mama and begging for a ticket back to civilization. What changed your mind?" She paused in her work, considering the question. "You kept getting up. Every time you fell off a horse, got kicked by a cow, or made yourself look like a fool, you got up and tried again. That counts for something. Even after the bull incident, especially after the bull incident. Most men would have been too embarrassed to show their faces around the barn for a month. You were back out there the next morning, asking to learn the right way." She smiled, and for once it was entirely without mockery. "That takes guts, even if they're city guts. City guts, still soft but getting tougher. Give it time." As summer deepened into its full heat, Fielder found himself settling into the rhythm of ranch life. His hands developed calluses, his back grew stronger, and his reflexes sharpened. He still made mistakes, plenty of them, but they were the mistakes of inexperience rather than complete incompetence. More importantly, he began to understand the subtle dynamics that made the ranch function. It wasn't just about cattle and crops and making money. It was about the relationships between the people who worked the land, the unspoken codes that governed behavior, and the way everyone looked out for everyone else, despite their gruff exteriors. And increasingly, his attention was drawn to Melrose Draven, the woman who could make him laugh even while she was insulting him, who worked harder than any 2 men, and who had secrets in her past that she guarded like a treasure chest. He was beginning to understand that learning to be a cowboy was only part of his education. The other part, learning to be a man worthy of a woman like Melrose, might prove to be the greater challenge. The third week of August brought unexpected visitors to Copper Ridge in the form of a traveling photographer and his assistant, who set up shop in the town's single hotel with promises of fine portraiture in the latest Eastern style. The arrival of any strangers in a town the size of Copper Ridge was enough to generate conversation, but these particular strangers carried an additional burden. They brought with them a story that some folks remembered and others wished they could forget. Fielder first learned about Melrose's past on a sweltering Thursday afternoon while he was in Henderson's general store picking up supplies for the ranch. He had been examining a selection of horseshoe nails when he overheard 2 women talking near the fabric counter. "Did you see her reaction when those photography fellows mentioned they'd come from Billings?" whispered Mrs. Eleanor Putnam, the banker's wife and the town's unofficial chronicler of gossip. "I surely did," replied Mrs. Constance Wheeler, who ran the boarding house and prided herself on knowing everyone's business better than they knew it themselves. "Went white as fresh cotton, she did. Guess it brought back memories of that whole mail-order bride business." Fielder's hand stilled on the nails he'd been counting. Mail-order bride. 4 years ago now, wasn't it? Mrs. Putnam continued, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a whisper, but which carried clearly across the store. "Poor girl traveled all that way from Kansas, thinking she was going to marry Joseph Drummond out at the Circle D. Only the letter got mixed up somehow," Mrs. Wheeler added with obvious relish. Wrong directions, wrong ranch, wrong everything. Can you imagine the embarrassment? Standing there on that doorstep with her traveling bag, all dressed up for her wedding, and the man tells her he never sent for any bride. Fielder felt his stomach drop. He tried to focus on the horseshoe nails, but the women's conversation drew him like a magnet. Joseph was decent enough about it. I heard, offered to put her up until she could arrange passage home, but her pride was too wounded, I suppose. Instead of going back to Kansas with her tail between her legs, she stayed right here and found work with old Tate. Made the best of a bad situation. I'll give her that. But you know how people talk. The bride nobody wanted. That's what they called her for the longest time. Some still do, though not to her face. That tongue of hers is sharp enough to cut leather. Mrs. Putnam chuckled. Remember when Harold Finch made some comment about her availability at the church social? She told him he had about as much charm as a dead fish and twice the intelligence. Harold turned redder than a ripe tomato. She's got spirit, I'll grant you that, but it must have been humiliating, being rejected like that. Makes you wonder if that's why she's never married. Once burned, twice shy, as they say. Fielder paid for his supplies in a daze and rode back to the ranch with his mind spinning. Everything suddenly made sense. Melrose's sharp edges, her quick wit that cut before anyone could cut her. The way she deflected personal questions with humor or sarcasm. She had built walls around her heart with jokes and attitude, protecting herself from ever being hurt that way again. That evening, Fielder found himself studying Melrose with new eyes as she served dinner. How had he missed the subtle signs of old pain beneath her confident exterior? The way she stiffened slightly when anyone mentioned traveling or letters or marriage. The defensive quality to her humor when it touched on personal subjects. "You're staring," she said without looking up from her plate. "Did I spill something on my dress?" "No, I just..." Fielder fumbled for words. "I was thinking. Dangerous habit for a man," she replied. "Thinking can lead to all sorts of trouble." Tate looked between them with interest. "What kind of thinking?" "The kind that's none of his business," Melrose said firmly. "Pass the potatoes." Later that evening, after Tate had retired to his room, Fielder found Melrose washing dishes at the kitchen sink. He picked up a dish rag and began drying, working in comfortable silence until he couldn't stand it anymore. "I heard something in town today," he said carefully. Her hands stilled for a moment in the soapy water. "Did you now? And what particular piece of gossip has caught your attention?" "About you. About why you came to Copper Ridge." She resumed washing with perhaps more vigor than the dishes required. "And, I'm sorry, that must have been difficult." "Difficult." She turned to face him, soap suds dripping from her hands. "That's one word for it. Humiliating would be another. Devastating might be more accurate. But difficult works. I can't believe any man would..." He stopped, realizing he was walking into dangerous territory. Would what? Turn away a woman who showed up on his doorstep unannounced and unwanted. Her voice was steady, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. Joseph Drummond was a perfect gentleman about the whole mess. The mistake wasn't his fault any more than it was mine. But still nothing. She turned back to the dishes. "It happened. I dealt with it. I moved on. End of story." "Is it though?" The words came out before he could stop them. "Moved on, I mean." She set down the plate she'd been washing and gripped the edge of the sink. "What exactly are you asking me, Fielder?" He took a deep breath. "I'm asking if you still carry that pain around, if you still feel like the bride nobody wanted." The silence stretched between them like a taut rope. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than he'd ever heard it. "Do you know what it's like to have your entire future planned out in your head, only to have someone look at you like you're damaged goods that got delivered to the wrong address?" She still hadn't turned around. "Do you know what it's like to have a whole town know your most embarrassing moment?" "No," he admitted. "But I know what it's like to feel like you don't belong anywhere, like you're not quite good enough for the life you want." She turned around slowly, studying his face. Is that how you feel? Every day since I got here. Maybe every day before that too. He set down the dish rag. The difference is, I chose to come here. You got thrown into it by a mistake. A mistake that turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me, she said, and seemed surprised by her own words. How do you figure? She was quiet for a long moment, considering. Because it taught me that I don't need a man to rescue me. I can rescue myself. I can make my own way in the world, earn my own living, and hold my head up no matter what people say behind my back. That's a hard way to learn independence. The best lessons usually are. She managed a small smile. Besides, if I'd married Joseph Drummond, I never would have met a city boy foolish enough to try milking a bull. And where's the fun in that? They both laughed, and some of the tension eased from the air. For what it's worth, Fielder said, I think Joseph Drummond is a fool. Any man who wouldn't want you is either blind or stupid, and probably both. She looked startled by the compliment, then suspicious. Careful, Cowboy. Flattery sounds strange coming from a man who can't tell a cow from a bull. It's not flattery if it's true, isn't it? She picked up the dish rag and began wiping down the counter with unnecessary thoroughness. Sweet words are easy to say, Fielder. It's the staying power that counts. What do you mean? I mean men are full of pretty speeches when they want something. But when the bloom wears off and reality sets in, they tend to remember they have other options, better options. The pain in her voice made his chest ache. Not all men, enough of them. She hung up the dish rag and faced him squarely. I learned something important from that whole mail-order bride disaster. I learned that counting on someone else for your happiness is a sure way to end up disappointed. So I don't count on anyone anymore. That sounds lonely. Lonely is better than rejected. At least lonely doesn't leave you standing on someone's doorstep with nowhere to go and everyone watching. Fielder wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that there were people who would stay, who would see her worth and never let her go. But he knew she wouldn't believe him. The words would sound empty coming from someone who had only known her for 3 weeks. Instead, he said, well, for what it's worth, I'm glad you ended up here, even if it was by mistake. Why? He met her eyes. Because this place wouldn't be the same without you, and neither would I. She stared at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. Then she shook her head as if clearing it of cobwebs. Don't go getting sentimental on me, city boy. I might start to think you're actually developing some character under all that Boston polish. Would that be so terrible? Terrible? No. Dangerous? Definitely. Dangerous how? But she was already heading toward the stairs, pausing only to blow out the kitchen lamp. Good night, Fielder. Try not to think too hard. We've got an early day tomorrow. He stood alone in the darkened kitchen, her words echoing in his head. Dangerous. What had she meant by that? Dangerous to whom? As he made his way to his own room, Fielder found himself thinking about the woman who could face down gossiping neighbors and cranky cattle with equal aplomb, but who had been wounded so deeply by one moment of rejection that she had built walls around her heart. He was beginning to understand that earning Melrose Draven's trust would be a bigger challenge than learning to rope cattle or break horses. It would require patience, consistency, and the kind of staying power she claimed not to believe in. The question was, did he have it in him? Could a city boy, who had spent 3 weeks learning to be a cowboy, also learn to be the kind of man who could heal old wounds and prove that some people do stay? As he lay in bed listening to the night sounds of the ranch, Fielder made himself a promise. He would prove to Melrose that not all men were like the ones who had disappointed her. He would show her that some promises were worth keeping and some hearts were worth trusting. He just hoped he was strong enough to keep that promise, even if it took years to convince her. Outside his window, a coyote howled in the distance, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the pain he had heard in Melrose's voice. But dawn would come, as it always did, bringing new chances and new possibilities, and tomorrow he would begin the real work of winning her heart. September arrived with the kind of crisp morning air that promised autumn was coming, whether folks were ready or not. The cottonwoods along the creek had begun to turn yellow at the edges, and the cattle were growing their winter coats. It was the time of year when ranchers started thinking about the long months ahead and hoping they had done enough during the good weather to see them through. For Fielder, the changing season brought a new confidence in his abilities. His hands were permanently stained with leather dye and rope burns now, and he could saddle a horse, mend a fence, and even milk an actual cow without embarrassing himself. The transformation hadn't gone unnoticed by the ranch hands, who had stopped making bets on when he would give up and go home. It was on a Tuesday morning that everything changed. Fielder was in the barn, helping Benton Rourke sort through the winter feed supplies, when they heard Melrose's voice calling from the house. There was something in her tone that made both men drop what they were doing and run toward the sound. They found her in the kitchen, kneeling beside Tate, who had collapsed near the table. His face was grey, and he was clutching his chest, breathing in short, painful gasps. "It came on sudden," Melrose said, her usual composure cracking around the edges. He was reaching for his coffee cup and just dropped. Fielder knelt on the other side of Tate, his mind racing. 3 weeks ago he wouldn't have known what to do in a crisis beyond panic and run in circles. Now something steadier took hold. "Benton, ride to town and fetch Doc Morrison," he said, surprised by the authority in his own voice. "Tell him it looks like Tate's heart. Melrose, help me get him to his bed. Since when do you give orders around here?" Melrose snapped, but she was already moving to support Tate's other arm. "Since there's nobody else to give them," Fielder replied, lifting his uncle with more strength than his clerk's frame should have possessed. They managed to get Tate to his room, where he lay pale and sweating against the pillows. His breathing had steadied some, but his color remained worrisome. "I'm not dying today," Tate wheezed, managing a weak smile. "Too much paperwork left undone." "Don't joke about dying, you old fool," Melrose said, but her voice shook slightly. "Save your strength." Doc Morrison arrived within the hour, a grizzled man who had been patching up cowboys and ranchers for 30 years. After a thorough examination, he emerged from Tate's room with a grave expression. "Hart's been working too hard for too long," he told Fielder and Melrose. "He needs complete rest for at least 6 weeks, maybe more. No stress, no excitement, and absolutely no ranch work." Melrose sank into a kitchen chair. 6 weeks? The cattle drive to Billings is scheduled for next month. The winter feed orders need to be placed. The bank payment is due in October. Then somebody else will have to handle it, Doc Morrison said, packing his medical bag. "Because if Grovelin tries to do ranch work anytime soon, the next time I see him will be to pronounce him dead." After the doctor left, Fielder and Melrose sat in the kitchen, the weight of responsibility settling over them like a heavy blanket. "Well," Melrose said finally, "I suppose this is where you pack your bags and head back to Boston. Can't say I blame you. Why would I do that?" She gave him a look that suggested his intelligence was questionable. "Because you're not ready to run a ranch, city boy. This isn't about learning to milk cows anymore. This is about payrolls and cattle prices, and men who'll test every decision you make." Fielder stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the land that had become more familiar than his childhood home. "You're right. I'm not ready, but Tate needs this place to survive, and so do you, and so do all the men who work here. Pretty sentiment. Won't pay the bills." He turned back to her. "Then we'll learn together. You know more about running this place than you let on, and I'm tired of being the greenhorn who can't handle responsibility." "We?" Her eyebrows rose. "Since when is there a we in this arrangement? Since I stopped being just Tate's nephew and started being—" He paused, searching for the right words. Someone who belongs here. Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise maybe, or the beginning of respect. Belonging and managing are two different things, Fielder. Then teach me the difference. The next morning brought the first real test. Jake Morrison, the lead wrangler, approached Fielder with a problem that would have sent the old Fielder running for help. We got trouble with the north pasture fence, Jake said. Looks like someone cut the wire deliberate-like. Cattle are scattered from here to Sunday. Rustlers? Fielder asked. Could be that new settler Crow trying to make a point about property lines. Fielder felt his stomach tighten. This was exactly the kind of situation where one wrong decision could cost the ranch money, cattle, or worse. 3 weeks ago he would have been paralyzed by indecision. Gather the men, he said. We'll ride out and assess the damage. And Jake, bring rifles, just in case. Melrose, who had been listening from the porch, walked over as the men dispersed to gather their gear. Not bad, she said grudgingly. Though if you get yourself shot, don't expect me to cry at your funeral. I'll try to avoid getting shot, just to spare your tear ducts. Thoughtful of you. She handed him a rifle. This belonged to Tate's father. It's killed more than its share of troubles. The ride to the north pasture revealed the full scope of the problem. Nearly 200 yards of fence had been systematically cut, and 30 head of cattle were missing. The cuts were too clean and deliberate to be anything but sabotage. Benton Rourke, examining the severed wire, shook his head grimly. This is Latham Crow's work, sure as shooting. He's been claiming that creek bed belongs to him since spring. Any proof? Fielder asked. Boot prints heading toward his property. Same distinctive heel mark we've seen before. Fielder studied the damaged fence, his mind working through options. The old Fielder would have sent someone to fetch Tate or ridden to town to involve the sheriff. The new Fielder, the one who was tired of being rescued, made a different choice. Jake, take half the men and start rounding up the scattered cattle. Benton, you and the others come with me. We're paying Mr. Crow a visit. The ride to Crow's property took 20 minutes through rough terrain that tested every skill Fielder had learned. His horse, sensing his new confidence, responded better than it ever had before. Latham Crow's homestead was a ramshackle affair that looked like it had been built by someone who thought straight lines were optional. Crow himself emerged from his cabin. As they approached, a tall, lean man with the kind of mustache that suggested he took himself very seriously. Well, Crow drawled. If it isn't the Boston boy playing rancher, where's old Tate hiding? Mr. Crow, Fielder said, dismounting but keeping his hand near his rifle. We have 30 head of cattle missing and 200 yards of cut fence. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Can't say I would. Cattle wander. Fences break. Nature of the business. Fences don't cut themselves in straight lines. Crow's eyes narrowed. You accusing me of something, boy? The word boys hung in the air like a challenge. A month ago, Fielder might have backed down, might have stammered and apologized and ridden away defeated. But a month ago, he hadn't been responsible for keeping a ranch afloat and protecting people he cared about. I'm saying 30 head of lazy T cattle are on your land, and I want them back. Now. And if I say no? Fielder looked at the ramshackle cabin, the poorly tended fields, the general air of a man barely scraping by. Then he looked at Benton and the other lazy T hands, all of whom were watching him with interest. Then I ride to town and file a complaint with Sheriff Martinez. He investigates, finds the cattle, and discovers you've been stealing from your neighbors. You lose the cattle, face criminal charges, and probably lose this homestead too. He paused, letting that sink in. Or you return the cattle now, pay for the fence repairs, and we forget this happened. Crow's face darkened. You threatening me? I'm offering you a choice. Make it quick. I've got work to do. For a tense moment, the only sounds were the wind through the grass and the creak of leather as men shifted in their saddles. Then Crow's shoulders sagged slightly. 30 head, you said. 30 head. plus $50 for fence repairs and lost time. 25, 40, final offer. Crow spat in the dust. Done. But this don't make us friends, Boston boy. Wouldn't dream of it, Fielder replied. But it makes us neighbors who respect each other's property. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the ride out, but Fielder could sense a change in how the men regarded him. Benton, in particular, seemed thoughtful. That was well handled, the foreman said as they approached the ranch house. Firm but fair. Tate would have been proud. Do you think Crow will cause more trouble? Men like Crow are bullies. They push until someone pushes back. You pushed back today. That evening, as Fielder updated the ranch ledgers by lamplight, Melrose brought him coffee and a slice of apple pie. Heard you faced down Latham Crow today, she said, settling into the chair across from him. News travels fast. Jake can't keep his mouth shut to save his life. Says you stared Crow down like a seasoned gunfighter. Fielder laughed. Hardly. I was terrified the whole time. Just tried not to show it. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Cowboy. It's being scared and doing what needs doing anyway. Where did you hear that? My grandmother. She was a wise woman who married a fool and spent 50 years making it work. Melrose sipped her coffee. So, think you can handle running this place? Ask me again in 6 months. I'm asking you now. He looked up from the ledger, meeting her steady gaze. I think I can handle whatever comes, with help. What kind of help? The kind that comes with sharp wit, excellent cooking, and the ability to keep a greenhorn from making a complete fool of himself. She was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. That kind of help doesn't come free. What's the cost? Respect, partnership, and no more treating me like hired help, who happens to be female. Fielder extended his hand across the table. Deal. She shook it, her grip firm and warm. Deal. Though I reserve the right to mock you when you do something stupid. I'd be disappointed if you didn't. October painted the Montana landscape in shades of gold and crimson, and with it came the kind of gossip that spread through small towns like wildfire through dry grass. Fielder's transformation from bumbling city boy to competent ranch manager hadn't gone unnoticed, particularly by the ladies of Copper Ridge, who had little else to occupy their minds. Have you seen how that Draven woman looks at the Haskett boy, Mrs. Putnam observed her companion over tea at Henderson's General Store. I surely have, Mrs. Wheeler replied, selecting fabric with the careful deliberation of someone who had strong opinions about thread count. And have you noticed how he defers to her opinion on ranch matters? Mark my words, that girl has set her cap for him. Well, she's had practice aiming at men, hasn't she? Mrs. Putnam's voice carried the satisfied tone of someone delivering particularly juicy gossip. First, the mail-order bride business with Joseph Drummond, now the boss's nephew. Pattern there, if you ask me. What neither woman realized was that Melrose herself was browsing fabric 3 aisles over, well within earshot of their conversation. She finished her shopping with a pleasant smile and left the store with her dignity intact. But Fielder knew something was wrong the moment he saw her face when she returned to the ranch. Rough day in town, he asked, taking the supply bags from her wagon. Oh, the usual small-town entertainment. Apparently, I'm the subject of fascinating speculation again. What kind of speculation? She climbed down from the wagon with perhaps more force than necessary. The kind that suggests I'm a calculating woman who sets her sights on whatever man happens to be convenient. Fielder felt heat rise in his chest. Who said that? Does it matter? The point is, people are talking. Again, she brushed dust from her skirt with sharp, angry movements. I thought I was past caring what this town thinks of me. You should be. Their opinions don't amount to a hill of beans. Easy for you to say. You're not the woman who's been gossiped about for 4 years running. That evening, Fielder found himself in an increasingly familiar position, sitting at the kitchen table, while Melrose worked out her frustration on innocent bread dough. You know what the worst part is, she said, punching the dough harder than strictly necessary. Part of me wonders if they're right. Right about what? About me being calculating. About setting my cap for you because you're convenient. Fielder looked up from the ranch accounts he'd been pretending to review. Are you? She paused in her kneading. Am I what? Setting your cap for me because I'm convenient. She faltered, then resumed her assault on the bread dough. I don't know. Maybe. Does it matter? It matters to me. Why? He set down his pen and turned to face her fully. Because I'd rather be wanted for myself than for my convenience. But more than that, I'd rather you be honest about what you want, instead of letting gossip make you second-guess your own heart. She shaped the dough into loaves with aggressive precision. My heart doesn't factor into ranch management decisions, doesn't it? No, it doesn't. But her voice lacked conviction. Then why do you look disappointed when I talk about maybe going back to Boston someday? I don't look disappointed. You do. Your face gets the same expression it had when Mrs. Wheeler mentioned that photographer from Billings. She spun around to face him. You've been watching my face. I've been watching everything about you. The way you hum when you're content. The way you get that little line between your eyebrows when you're worried. The way you smile when you think nobody's looking. Stop. The way you care about this ranch and everyone on it, even when you pretend you're just doing a job. I said stop. The way you've made this place feel like home in a way Boston never did. Fielder, I mean it. I love you. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Melrose stared at him, flour-dusted hands suspended in mid-gesture. You what? I love you. Not because you're convenient. Not because you happen to be here. Because you're brave and funny and strong, and you make every day better just by being in it. She sank into a chair as if her legs had given out. You can't love me. Why not? Because I'm the bride nobody wanted. Because I've got more sharp edges than a broken bottle. Because you're going to wake up someday and realize you could do better. Melrose. What? You're an idiot. Her mouth fell open. I beg your pardon. You're an intelligent, capable woman who can manage a ranch, face down rustlers, and make biscuits that would make angels weep. But when it comes to your own worth, you're a complete idiot. How dare you? Any man who didn't want you was too stupid to deserve you, including Joseph Drummond, who I'm beginning to think dodged a bullet when that letter got mixed up. She glared at him. Meaning what? Exactly. Meaning you would have been wasted on him. You're meant for better things than being some rancher's quiet little wife who keeps house and asks no questions. And what am I meant for? According to you. He stood up and walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of her chair. You're meant to be a partner, an equal, someone who builds something bigger than either of you could manage alone. Pretty words. True words. She looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd known her, Melrose Draven seemed uncertain. What if you're wrong? What if I'm not worth all this feeling? Then I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. What if the gossips are right? What if I am just a calculating woman looking for security? Then you're human, but I don't think that's all you are. She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face, as if trying to read his soul. What if I hurt you? What if you don't? What if I disappoint you? What if you don't? What if you don't? What if Melrose? What? Stop borrowing trouble and answer one question. Do you love me? Another long silence, then so quietly he almost missed it. Yes. Say it again. I love you. Louder this time, as if testing the words. God help me. I love you too. He cupped her face in his hands, marveling at the softness of her skin beneath the flour dust. Then the gossips can go hang themselves. All that matters is us. Us. Partners. Equals. Whatever comes next. She laughed, and it was her real laugh, not the defensive one she used as armor, but the one that came from genuine joy. Lord help us both. Do you know what you're getting yourself into? A lifetime of arguments. sharp wit, and the best biscuits in Montana, among other things. I can live with that, even when I'm impossible, especially when you're impossible." She stood up and kissed him then, flower and all, and Fielder thought that he finally understood what it meant to be exactly where you belonged. The wedding took place on a crisp November morning in the little white church at the edge of Copper Ridge, with half the town in attendance. True to form, the guests had come for mixed reasons, some to celebrate, others to whisper, and a few to see if the bride would bolt again. Reverend Samuel Morrison had agreed to perform the ceremony, despite having some reservations about the haste of the engagement. "Are you certain about this union?" he had asked Fielder during their private consultation. "Marriage is a sacred commitment, not a convenience." "I'm certain," Fielder had replied. "More certain than I've ever been about anything." The morning of the wedding found Melrose in a state of controlled panic, which she was managing by rearranging the furniture in Tate's room for the third time. "Stop fussing, girl," Tate wheezed from his bed, where he had been relegated to the role of observer rather than participant. "The furniture was fine the first time you moved it." "I'm not fussing, I'm organizing." She adjusted his pillow for the fifth time. "There's a difference. The difference being that when you organize, you mutter under your breath and bang things around. I don't bang things around. Tell that to the chair you just relocated with enough force to wake the dead." Melrose sank into the newly relocated chair and put her head in her hands. "What if I'm making a mistake? What if he changes his mind? What if you stop borrowing trouble and go marry that boy before he comes to his senses?" She looked up. "You think he might come to his senses? Not a chance. He looks at you like you hung the moon and painted the stars. It's nauseating, frankly." "That's very romantic, Tate." "I'm not a romantic man. I'm a practical man. And practically speaking, that boy is so besotted with you, he'd probably marry you if you had 3 heads and a tail." Charming image. "My point is, you're worrying about the wrong things. Instead of wondering if he'll change his mind, maybe ask yourself if you're ready to stop running from happiness." Meanwhile, in the barn, Fielder was receiving his own version of pre-wedding counsel from Benton Rourke and the ranch hands. "Marriage is like breaking horses," offered Jake Morrison, who had been married 3 times and divorced twice. "You got to be patient, gentle, and ready to get thrown now and then." "Marriage is like branding cattle," countered Charlie Webb, whose wife had left him for a traveling salesman. "Quick, painful, and permanent." "Marriage," said Benton Rourke with the authority of a man who had been happily wed for 23 years, "is like running a ranch. Lots of hard work, occasional disasters, and the satisfaction of building something that lasts." "That's surprisingly profound, Benton," Fielder said, adjusting his tie for the 10th time. "Don't sound so surprised. I got depths." The ceremony itself was mercifully brief, though not without its memorable moments. When Reverend Morrison asked if anyone had reason why the couple should not be wed, Mrs. Wheeler actually opened her mouth as if to speak, only to be silenced by a sharp elbow from Mrs. Putnam. When the Reverend asked if Melrose would take Fielder as her lawfully wedded husband, she paused just long enough to let the entire congregation hold its breath before grinning and saying, "Well, I suppose someone's got to keep him from milking the wrong end of a cow." The church erupted in laughter, and for the first time since arriving in Copper Ridge, Melrose laughed along with them instead of feeling like the butt of their jokes. The reception, held in the church hall, featured a potluck dinner that showcased the best and worst of local cooking. Mrs. Henderson's apple pie was declared perfect, while Widow Morrison's mystery casserole remained largely untouched. "What do you think is in it?" Fielder whispered to his new wife. "Death," Melrose replied solemnly, "and possibly green beans." Their first months of marriage coincided with one of the harshest winters in recent memory. Snow fell in quantities that made travel difficult and ranch work dangerous. Cattle needed to be fed daily, Water sources had to be kept from freezing, and equipment required constant maintenance in conditions that froze exposed skin in minutes. It was during this brutal season that Fielder and Melrose learned what it truly meant to be partners. They quarreled over everything: money, priorities, his tendency to track mud through the house, her habit of leaving coffee grounds in the pot. "You're supposed to empty the grounds," Fielder complained one particularly bitter morning, "not leave them to fossilize." "You're supposed to wipe your boots," Melrose shot back, "not paint the kitchen floor with half the barnyard." "I wiped my boots." "Where? On the porch? The rug? Or did you just wave them in the general direction of cleanliness?" These domestic disputes might have destroyed a weaker partnership, but they served instead to establish the rhythm of their marriage. Every argument ended the same way, with both of them sitting at the kitchen table, sharing whatever food was available, too stubborn to apologize, but too committed to stay angry. It was during one such post-argument meal, cold biscuits and leftover stew, that Fielder made an observation that would define their relationship. "We argue a lot," he said, breaking his biscuit into smaller pieces. "We do," Melrose agreed, stirring her stew without much interest. "But we keep sitting down together afterward, seems like. That has to count for something." She looked up from her bowl. "What do you think it counts for?" "I think it means we're building something. Something that can survive a little weather." "This is more than a little weather, Cowboy. This is a full-scale winter siege." "Same principle applies." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind howl around the house corners. Finally, Melrose spoke. "You know what I realized today?" "What?" "I don't mind the arguing. It means we both care enough to fight for what we want, even when what we want is contradictory. Especially then. Means neither of us is just giving in to keep the peace." Fielder reached across the table and took her hand. "So we're going to keep arguing?" "Oh, definitely. But we're also going to keep sitting down together afterward." "Good. I was worried marriage might be boring." Spring brought new challenges in the form of debt collectors, cattle disease, and equipment failures that tested every skill they had developed. The bank payment came due just as a late blizzard killed 30 head of cattle, wiping out the profit margin they had counted on. "We're $200 short," Melrose announced, looking up from the account books with the expression of someone who had been doing unpleasant mathematics. "Can we borrow against next year's crop?" "Already did that to cover the winter feed costs." Fielder sat down heavily in his chair. 6 months ago this news would have sent him into a panic. Now it just made him tired. Options? Sell some breeding stock. Take out a loan at rates that'll cripple us next year. Or convince the bank to extend the payment deadline, which is most likely to work. The breeding stock sale, but it'll hurt our long-term prospects. They sat in silence, both understanding the impossible mathematics of ranching, the way short-term survival often conflicted with long-term success. "What would Tate do?" Fielder asked finally. "Tate would ride to the bank, charm Mrs. Patterson, the secretary, and somehow walk out with an extension and a better interest rate." "Think that would work for us?" Melrose laughed, but it was a sound without much humor. "Tate has 40 years of history with that bank. We have 6 months and a reputation for being the couple everyone's still gossiping about. Then we'll have to be more charming than usual." "I don't do charming, Cowboy. I do competent, efficient, and occasionally terrifying." "Then I'll do the charming, and you do the terrifying. Between us we might convince them we're worth the risk." The trip to Copperidge First Bank was an exercise in controlled desperation. Banker Harrison Caldwell was a man who had seen too many ranchers overextend themselves and had developed the attitude of someone perpetually disappointed by human financial judgment. "Young man," he said, reviewing their application with the enthusiasm of someone examining a dead fish, "this ranch has been marginal for 3 years running. Your uncle's illness created additional expenses, and now you're asking for an extension on a payment you should have planned for months ago." "All true," Fielder admitted, But we've also increased productivity, resolved the rustling problems, and positioned ourselves for a profitable year if we can weather this temporary shortage. Temporary shortage. Caldwell made the word sound like a moral failing. Every failing ranch claims their problems are temporary. It was then that Melrose leaned forward and fixed the banker with the same stare she used on recalcitrant cattle. Mr. Caldwell, let me explain something about temporary versus permanent. Permanent is what happens when you foreclose on a ranch that's been making steady improvements. Permanent is the reputation you get for destroying local businesses over short-term cash flow problems. Permanent is what will make sure everyone in this county knows about your banking practices if you force us into bankruptcy over $200. Caldwell blinked. Are you threatening me, Mrs. Haskett? I'm explaining the mathematics of small-town business, Mr. Caldwell. You can extend our payment deadline by 60 days and earn interest on the full amount, or you can foreclose now and explain to your other customers why the Lazy Ta Ranch is up for auction, because you couldn't show flexibility to a couple who's improved every aspect of the operation. There was a long moment of silence, then Caldwell cleared his throat. 60 days, at an additional 2% interest. 1%. Melrose countered. 1.5. Deal. Walking out of the bank, Fielder shook his head in amazement. Remind me never to get on your bad side. Too late for that, Cowboy. You married me. You're permanently on my bad side. Is that a threat or a promise? Both. The third year of their marriage brought a happiness so unexpected that neither of them quite knew what to do with it. The ranch was finally showing consistent profits. Tate's health had stabilized enough for him to resume light duties, and their partnership had evolved into something that felt as natural as breathing. It also brought a silence that grew louder with each passing month. Doc Morrison says there's nothing wrong with either of us, Melrose announced one evening, setting down her mending with more force than necessary. We're both perfectly healthy, perfectly capable of having children, and perfectly mystified about why it's not happening. Fielder looked up from the breeding records he'd been studying. 3 years of marriage had taught him to recognize the particular tone that meant his wife was angry at the universe in general, rather than at him specifically. Maybe it's just not the right time, he offered carefully. When is the right time? When I'm 40, 50, when we're too old to chase a toddler around the barnyard. Maybe. Don't maybe me, Fielder Haskett. I've wanted children since I was old enough to understand what children were. I've planned nurseries in my head, chosen names, imagined teaching a little girl to cook, or watching a little boy learn to ride. She stood up and began pacing the kitchen with the restless energy of someone who had nowhere to direct their frustration. Do you know what Mrs. Wheeler said to me yesterday? Maybe that wrong bride was cursed, as if my past somehow disqualified me from having a family. Mrs. Wheeler is an idiot. Maybe, or maybe she's right. Maybe I'm being punished for something. Maybe I don't deserve. Stop. Fielder stood up and caught her mid-pace, holding her shoulders until she met his eyes. You deserve every happiness in the world, including children. If it doesn't happen, it won't be because you don't deserve it. Then why? I don't know why, but I know that beating yourself up about it won't change anything. She leaned against him then, and he could feel the tension slowly leaving her shoulders. I just feel so empty sometimes, like there's this space inside me that's supposed to be filled with something important, and it's just not. I know. Do you, really? He was quiet for a moment, considering how to put his own feelings into words. Every time I see Jake Morrison's little boy helping with the horses, I imagine teaching our son to ride. Every time Mrs. Patterson brings her daughter to town, I picture you braiding our daughter's hair. So yes, I know what you mean about the empty space. They held each other in the lamplight kitchen. Two people who had found everything they thought they wanted, except the one thing they wanted most. What if it never happens? Melrose whispered. Then we'll have each other, and we'll make that be enough. Will it be enough? It'll have to be. But fate, as it often does, had been listening to their conversation and decided to intervene with the timing that makes people believe in providence. 6 weeks later, Melrose woke up feeling dizzy and nauseated, symptoms she initially attributed to a batch of questionable eggs. When the symptoms persisted for a week, she began to suspect something more significant. Dr. Morrison confirmed her suspicions with the kind of gentle smile that suggested he had been waiting for this conversation for years. Congratulations, Mrs. Haskett. I'd say you're about 2 months along. Melrose sat in stunned silence for so long that the doctor began to look concerned. Mrs. Haskett, are you all right? She started laughing, a sound that contained equal parts joy and hysteria. I'm going to have a baby. Yes, you are. Probably sometime in February, if my calculations are correct. February. She said it like it was a magical word. I'm going to have a February baby. The ride home from town passed in a haze of disbelief and planning. By the time she reached the ranch, Melrose had already decided on 3 different nursery arrangements and was debating the merits of various baby names. She found Fielder in the barn, working on a saddle that had seen better decades. He looked up when she entered, immediately noticing something different in her expression. How did the doctor's appointment go? He asked. Well, she said, trying to keep her voice casual, he says I'm perfectly healthy. Both of us are perfectly healthy. Both of you, me and the baby. The leather punch slipped from Fielder's suddenly nerveless fingers. Baby? February baby, according to Doc Morrison. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Fielder crossed the barn in 3 strides and swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she was dizzy with laughter. A baby, he kept repeating. We're going to have a baby. Put me down, you fool, before you make me sick. I've been nauseous enough already. He set her down gently, as if she were made of spun glass. Are you all right? Should you be riding? Should you be working? Should I be treated like an invalid for the next 7 months? Absolutely not. I'm pregnant, not dying. But nothing. I intend to keep working, keep cooking, and keep arguing with you right up until this baby decides to make an appearance. What if something goes wrong? Fielder asked, but Melrose was already heading for the door. Then we'll handle it together, like everything else. February brought their daughter during a blizzard that trapped Doc Morrison at the ranch for 3 days. Little Adelaine arrived red-faced and wailing, with her father's stubborn chin and her mother's fierce spirit. She's got lungs like a steam engine, Melrose observed, exhausted but radiant as she held their daughter. Heaven help us all. Years later, when Adelaine asked how her parents met, Melrose would smile and say, "Through the post office, sweetheart. Worst way to find a husband, but the best mistake I ever made."